World War II facts to fall asleep to a soldier's quiet archive. The fact that wasn't in the book, they always begin with dates, the books, the lessons, the documentaries. September 1st, 1939. Germany invades Poland. Okay? And suddenly, the world is burning again. But that's not where the war began for me. It didn't start with a map, or a radio broadcast, or a line of marching boots. It started with a quiet knock at the door. Just past midnight, the sound of my mother holding her breath in the next room. That knock was the fact no one wrote down. The fact that cracked open the world I thought I knew. I was 19. I hadn't yet learned how to shave properly. I still thought in poems, still believed that all uniforms made people better. I'd never held a rifle. I'd never lied to someone I loved. I'd never seen a man die. Not yet, but all of that was waiting. Not in the books, not in the headlines, but in the soft spaces between things, where silence grows before it has a name. The papers say the war began when tanks crossed a border. Maybe that's true, okay, but maybe the real war starts before that. Maybe it begins the moment someone says, "We're not like them." Maybe it begins when a mother is afraid to say her son's name out loud, or when a child learns to lie without blinking. These aren't facts you find in museums, but they live in the cracks where history forgets to look. They say 6 million died here, 11 million there, 20 million in the cold. The numbers stack like bricks in a wall too tall to climb, but no one tells you what a single pair of shoes left. It's behind in the mud smells like after the rain. No one tells you that when the shelling stops, your body keeps flinching for weeks. No, one tells you that hunger isn't always in the belly. Sometimes it's in the memory. There's a photograph of me in uniform, stiff, back straight, eyes a little too wide. People look at it and say, "You must have been proud." I wasn't. I was terrified, not of death, but of what I might have to become in order to survive. You see, that's a fact too. The war doesn't just kill people, it rewrites them. On the second night of basic training, a boy beside me asked, "What do you think your last words will be?" We both laughed, too nervous to answer honestly. But I remembered the question more than his name, because that's what the war does. It teaches you to remember questions more than people, because people disappear, but questions, they stay. I kept a journal, sort of scraps of paper, edges of maps, the inside of my boot. Once, I wrote things I couldn't say out loud, not secrets, not strategy, just truths, like, "I don't think, I hate them, still dream in color. I miss the sound of spoons in teacups." They're small things, unimportant by the world's measure, but I carried them because when everything around you is fire and steel and smoke, you cling to the facts that don't explode once. In France, I saw a man pull a crumpled letter from his pocket and read it aloud to a patch of dirt. There was no grave there, silence. He folded it back and said, "She wouldn't have wanted me to forget how to speak." That moment never made it into the records. No medal, no mention, but it changed me more than any general speech, because I realized facts are not just what happened. They are what we remember when we're trying not to disappear. There's a number they taught us in training, 1,000 rounds per hour. It's the firepower of a machine gun, but they never told us the number of men who whispered apologies before they fired. They never counted the prayers spoken in wrong languages. They never measured how long it takes for a boy to stop writing home when the words feel too clean. Another fact, the first time I killed someone, I didn't know if he was older or younger than me. I only knew he had blue on his collar and that he hesitated before raising his rifle. That hesitation still lives somewhere under my ribs. I once sat beside a German prisoner who offered me chocolate. He said nothing, just handed it over. I waited. I took it. He nodded, We never spoke again. But, for a moment, we're just two boys who missed our mothers. That wasn't in any textbook, but I carry it still. There are facts they can't teach you. How uniforms don't make monsters fear does. How sometimes the bravest thing is to not shoot. How silence can scream louder than bombs. How the smell of winter never leaves your bones once it's entered them during war. There's a crack in my memory where a man used to be. I don't remember his name, but I remember he used to hum when it rained. That's all. It's just hum. I hope someone, somewhere, still hears that tune. Years later, I walked through a museum. They had a wall of facts, dates, maps, flags, and one small display case. Inside, a spoon, a matchbox, a folded sock. No names, just a plaque, recovered from a soldier's pack, 1944. I stood there for 20 minutes, not because I knew who owned them, but because I knew the weight they must have carried. A spoon can be a memory, a sock, a prayer. A matchbox, a last attempt at light. These aren't props. They're proof that the war was made of people, not just plans. So, if you're listening to this, hoping for numbers, I'll give you one more 1.1 heartbeat, one letter unsent, one breath held before dawn, one truth carried for decades, one story never told until now. That's where the war really lives, in the space between facts, in the silences we survived, in the softness that somehow stayed intact. The facts, buried in boots. They told us the boots were standard issue, durable, efficient, made to last, but they never told us how they'd change shape. Not the leather, the sole. They never told us that. Your boots would begin to carry more than your body. They'd carry your story. And sometimes, the facts you needed to remember weren't in a journal, weren't in a letter. They were under your feet. My first pair were too tight. I didn't complain. None of us did. We broke them in with blisters and silence, with miles that didn't lead anywhere but further away from home. After a while, I stopped noticing the pain. But I never stopped noticing the way the ground changed me. Each place we passed through left something on the soul, not just mud or blood or sand, but memory. Memory has weight. And boots, don't forget, there was a man in our unit who refused to throw his old laces away, even when they frayed to threads, even when new ones were handed out. He told me these were tied by my brother. First day I left, I'm not changing them. He died with those laces on. I took one and kept it. To this day, it holds more truth than any metal. They say a soldier's boots can tell you where he's been, but they can also tell you what he carried. Not just externally, internally were his steps light. Was he dragging grief behind him? Did he march with certainty, or with the hesitation of a man not yet at peace? You learn to read the gait of a man before you ever hear his voice, and in war, that might be all you get to know. There was a boy, Jack. He walked on his toes, always, even on patrol. He said it helped him stay quiet, but I think he was afraid of waking the dead. One night, we were caught in shell fire. We ran. I didn't realize I was still holding his sleeve until I stopped, but he wasn't there. All that remained were his boots, perfectly upright, as if he'd stepped out of them and into the air. We buried them, side by side. No cross, just a stone. Somewhere, he's still walking. And I hope he found ground that doesn't shake. Facts, they say, are what can be verified. But the fact of Jack's boots, the way they stood alone, it's a prawl that was more truth than any document could hold. Once, we found a German soldier's boots, abandoned, but perfectly clean, lined with wool. Inside one, a folded paper, a child's drawing, a house, a sun, two stick figures holding hands. We didn't burn it. We didn't keep it. We tucked it back inside. and set the boots against a wall. Even enemies deserve to be remembered for more than their flag. That's a fact no one teaches you. Some men carve things, into the leather. Initials, dates, symbols. One man etched a line from a poem, "I walk, not alone." His boots were found months later, empty, but the words were still there. That's the thing about boots. They outlive the voices, and sometimes it's the only thing left to tell the story. My own boots aged like skin, creased, weathered, soft, in some places, hard in others. They began to smell like everything I couldn't say. Dirt, ash, hope. Hope smells like pine needles after rain, like bread crust, like a letter you've already read 20 times. When we were forced to retreat from Belgium, stepped on a photograph, black and white, water-stained, a woman smiling with her head tilted slightly. I picked it up, tried it on, my pant leg, tucked it into my boot. She stayed with me for 6 months, through frostbite, through silence, through nights when the only warmth was memory. I never knew her name, but I spoke to her sometimes, not because I believed she listened, but because my boots needed to believe we were walking toward something human. Facts, the historians forget. A pebble in the boot can feel heavier than a rifle. Wet socks can break a man's spirit faster than gunfire. When you march for hours, your memories rise to the surface like blisters. The quieter the road, the louder your thoughts. Sometimes a man would swap boots with a dead comrade because his were warmer, knew it, and he would carry that guilt forever. After the war, I couldn't wear leather for a year, not because of trauma, because the creak of the material sounded like footsteps from a place I'd never returned to. I walked barefoot around the house. My wife thought it was eccentric. Maybe it was, but I needed to feel the ground again without being asked to survive. Eventually, I buried my boots, not in ceremony, not in shame, just under an old tree. Behind the barn, I folded a note into one of them. "You carried me farther than I deserved. Thank you." It rained that night, and I imagined the facts folded into letters. The facts folded into letters. The facts hidden in rain. It always starts the same way. A low roll in the distance. Not thunder, though it sounds like it. Not shellfire, though we all flinch the same. It's the sky warning us in its own quiet language. I'm about to remember you. Then comes the first drop. Cold, sharp, private. The kind that finds its way beneath your collar like a secret. No one was supposed to know. That's the moment I knew. The rain wasn't just water. It was memory falling one drop at a time. They never listed it among the weapons, but it had power, more than we gave it credit for. It erased footprints, softened barbed wire, made every uniform the same shade of regret. It blurred the borders between nations, between friends and enemies, between hope and surrender, and in the spaces between those drops, the real war often whispered its name. Some men cursed the rain, others welcomed it, because when it poured, the sky did the crying for us. No one could see your face in a downpour. No one could measure the shaking in your hands when everything else was shaking too. And for a few hours, the war became a little more silent, a little more human. There was a boy in my company, Theo, red hair, freckles like paint splatter. He used to walk into the rain with his arms wide open like he was receiving communion. "Let it wash me," he'd whisper. Just for a moment. He never said what it needed to wash off. None of us did, but we all knew there were things we carried that only the rain dared touch. Once we were pinned down in a field. No cover. Shells had stopped, but we didn't dare move. And then the clouds broke open, thick sheets of silver pouring from above. We lay there for hours, soaked, silent, and somewhere in that stillness, I remember thinking, Maybe this is the world starting over. Maybe this is forgiveness falling gently over everything we ruined. Of course, it wasn't, but it felt like it. And sometimes, feeling is the closest we get to truth. There's a fact I never found in the books. In the rain, we all looked the same, mud-caked, eyes down, hearts exposed. There were no medals in the rain, no speeches, no sides, just people trying not to vanish in the gray dot. In Normandy, I watched a soldier kneel beside a tree. He wasn't praying. He was planting something, a single seed, in the middle of nowhere. Rain dripping from his helmet. He looked up at me and said, "If I don't make it, maybe this will." He never told me what it was, but I think about that seed every time I hear thunder now, wondering if it ever grew. Something lived because he hoped it would. Some men wrote poems when it rained, on the backs of ration wrappers, on their own hands, on their boots. One wrote, "The bullets pause when heaven weeps, so let her cry until we sleep." We never knew his name, just that he left that behind inside a burned out tank no one claimed. Sometimes the rain carries poetry longer than any living voice. It ruined maps, it smeared ink, it warped letters, but it also cleaned the blood from our fingers, washed the smoke from our hair. It turned craters into mirrors and mud into memory. Every step in the rain was a question. Do I go forward? Do I wait? And every answer was silent, because in the rain, the war stopped yelling. It began to whisper. There's a truth they don't teach. In the rain, we remembered who we were before the noise. We remembered the soft things, wool sweater, a mother's touch, the weight of a coat too big for your frame because it once belonged to your brother. The rain brought those things back, not clearly, but enough to remind us that we weren't born into this, that we had names before we had numbers. One night, it rained so hard we couldn't tell where the ground ended and the sky began. We were wading through memory, chest deep, and in that flood, I dropped my rifle. I didn't reach for it, not because I didn't care, but because, for the first time, I wasn't afraid. The rain had taken the fear. Or maybe it had made me remember that I'd been afraid for too long. Either way, I stood there, empty-handed, eyes closed, and for one breath, I was a boy again. Later, someone handed me a new rifle, but I held it differently after that, not as a weapon, but as a memory that hadn't yet been made. Facts lost in rain. A song hummed between trenches becomes a lullaby no bullet can erase. A kiss remembered in the wet silence feels warmer than fire. A prayer muttered into a helmet echoes longer than any gunshot. The color of the sky before dawn in Belgium looked like my sister's dress. The sound of rain on tin made men weep and others laugh. There was a village we passed through, empty, except for one old man. He was sweeping the stone steps of a chapel in the middle, a thunderstorm. I asked him why. He smiled and said, "The rain is already cleaning. I'm just helping him remember how we left him there, soaked, peaceful." That image stays with me, a reminder that not all resistance wears a uniform. Later that night, we camped under what was left of a barn. I heard someone crying, not loud, not broken, just a steady stream of sound, like the rain had found its way into someone's chest and decided to stay. No one asked who it was. No one tried to stop it. We just listened. Let it pass, because crying in the rain is not a weakness. It's a kind of honesty rarely allowed in war. After everything, the guns had quieted and the boots were hung up, I found myself missing the rain, not the discomfort, not the shivers, but the truth it carried. The way it stripped everything down to its simplest form. Man, mud, memory, the world reduced to what mattered. If you ever visit a battlefield and the sky begins to weep, don't let it fall on your shoulders. Let it touch your face. Because in that rain are the voices of the ones who walked before you, the ones who slept under trees, whispered their last words into the earth, okay, who prayed not for victory, but for return. That rain remembers them, and now, so do you. The facts that fit in a tin cup. They gave us 10 cups on the first day, one each, no extras, no replacements. It was part of the standard kit, but there was nothing standard about how we used them. At first, it was just for coffee, then soup, then water, 10 memory, because eventually, everything we held that still felt human fit inside a tin cup. There's something intimate about drinking from something so bare. No handle, no color, no name, just you and the metal, the warmth or the absence of it, and every time you lifted it to your lips, you knew exactly how much was left. That's how I measured my days, not by hours, not by bullets, but by how long. The warmth stayed in my cup. Some men painted the inside, not with brushes, but with whatever they could find: ashes, ink, crushed leaves, blood symbols, words, a drawing of a child's face, a dog, a hill they missed when we drank from them. We didn't just consume the liquid, we consumed the reminder that we were still men, not machines, and that mattered more than food. There was a soldier named Brenner, quiet, kept to himself. His tin cup had a dent the size of a coin on the side. Said it happened the day his brother died. He never straightened it, never replaced it, drank from it every day like it was part of his spine. When he was hit outside Arnhem, Scud was gone before we reached him, but someone brought me the cup. I still have it, and that dent, that quiet, unspoken grief is still there. You'd be surprised how many truths could fit in those cups. Regret, gratitude, rainwater, laughter. The last cigarette passed hand to hand. The heat of broth when someone gave you their portion. All of it lived there, in something small enough to carry in a palm, yet heavy enough to carry the weight of absence. We shared them, even when we weren't supposed to, because sometimes sharing a sip was the only way to say, I still see you. You still exist. You're not alone. And sometimes the person offering didn't say a word, just held it out like a hand or a prayer. In the coldest places, we'd use them to heat stones, place a few rocks in the fire, drop them into water, watch steam rise like ghosts returning to ask why. That steam, it had a smell, not of death, not of decay, but of persistence. And I loved that smell because it told me the fire hadn't gone out, not yet. Facts that lived. In cups, you can drink sorrow in silence and still be grateful. The sound of metal tapping against another cup becomes its own language. A chipped rim teaches you to drink carefully, especially from trust. When you hear liquid swirl inside, you remember you're alive. The way someone holds their cup can tell you what they lost. In Italy, I saw a man use his cup to scoop snow just to press it against his eyes. He said, I don't want to see this anymore. But he kept watching anyway, kept surviving, kept refilling his cup with whatever he could find. Tea, rain, melted snow. Silence. We all did, because the cup was the only thing that didn't ask for explanations. It just received. There was one night, bitter cold, no fire, no fire. We passed a single tin cup around the circle, each of us pretending it held something warm. It didn't, but the act of passing, the rhythm of it, was enough to keep us anchored to each other, to the fact that we were still there, still breathing, still able to hold something, even if it was just the echo of what used to be. After the war, I couldn't drink from glass for years. Too clean, too invisible, fragile. I missed the scrape of tin, the weight of metal against palm, the way heat spread unevenly and burned your lip if you weren't careful. There was honesty in that. Burn, a reminder that even small comforts come with cost. They say war strips everything away. I agree, but sometimes what remains is the truest part of you. And for me, what remained was a tin cup, blackened, bent, but whole, like me, at the refugee camp. I gave mine to a boy. He was shaken, barefoot, covered in dust. I poured what was left of my tea inside and handed it to him without a word. He looked at me, eyes like winter, and drank. I never saw him again. But sometimes in dreams, I imagined that cup made its way across borders, across years, carrying kindness that didn't need a name. One man carved the words, "If I can hold this, I can hold on." And that's what we all did. Held on down to the rim, to the warmth, to the meaning tucked into the most unlikely of places. Because in war, it's the big things, they fail you, orders, politics, plans. But the small things, they save you. And nothing was smaller or more sacred than a tin cup filled with something that reminded you why you hadn't let go yet. Some men sang into them, quiet lullabies, songs from their mothers, old folk tunes. The cup turned the sound into something soft, private, contained, like memory being boiled down to something that wouldn't spoil. When I was sent home, I packed mine last, not the medals, not the uniform, the cup, wrapped it in an old sock, carried it like a heartbeat that no one could hear but me. Years later, my grandson asked what I missed most from the war. I said, the tin cup. He laughed, but I wasn't joking, because inside that cup was everything I survived, everything I lost, everything I never said out loud. And even now, on quiet mornings, I sometimes sip from it again, not because I need to drink, but because I need to remember how much could live inside so little. The facts that slept in pockets. We used to joke that a soldier's real uniform wasn't what he wore, it was what he carried in his pockets, because that's where the war softened. That's where it shrank into pieces, small enough to hide, to hold, to remember quietly when the guns stopped, and what we carried said everything about who we still were beneath the mud, beneath the orders, beneath the fear. Pockets became confessionals, time capsules, tiny museums of a life we couldn't live anymore, but couldn't quite let go of either inside one. You might find a folded letter, the crease worn nearly through. Inside another, a pebble smooth from thumb rubs, taken from a stream that reminded someone of home. They weren't weapons, but they protected us just the same. I had 3 things in my left pocket: a stub of pencil, a torn photograph of my father, and a scrap of newspaper with the crossword unfinished. I never completed it. That was the point. Somehow, leaving the puzzle open made me feel like the story wasn't over yet. There was a man in our unit, Collins. He carried a chess piece in his pocket, a black knight, carved from wood, worn down around the base like it had traveled more than he had. When I asked him about it, he said nothing, just turned it over in his palm like it knew more than he did. After the war, someone mailed it back to him, found it tucked into his coat. When he was hit, they say he kept it by his bed until the day he died. No more games, but the piece remained. There's a strange intimacy to pockets. No one looks there without permission. No one empties them lightly. And yet, in battle, they became the last place we were truly ourselves. We could wear the same uniform, march the same path, eat the same rations, but our pockets held what made us different. One man kept marbles, not many, just 2, said they belonged to his brother, kept them for luck. Once, under heavy fire, he dropped one, refused to move until he found it, crawled through ash and shattered stone, finally held it up like a piece of his soul had returned. We didn't mock him, we understood. You don't leave your memory behind, not even for war. Another man carried a tiny spoon, said it was from his grandmother, straw. It had a bend in the handle and a chip of enamel missing. He used it for everything: coffee, soup, measuring powder. Said it reminded him that once, He'd been loved in a quiet kitchen where nothing exploded except laughter. Medic I knew kept bandage pins in his chest pocket, more than he needed. I asked him why. He said, "So I never forget what I'm for." That stuck with me because pockets didn't just carry things, they carried purpose, or the need for one. There was a boy who carried nothing, not a scrap, not a note, not a coin. When we asked why, he said, "If I keep nothing, maybe nothing can be taken." He was wrong, but I never had the heart to tell him. Even empty pockets carry something. Even silence takes shape when worn long enough. Later, I met a man who carried a harmonica, tiny, barely 2 notes functional, but when he played it, even broken, you could feel the air change, not the sound, but the attempt, the willingness to make music where music shouldn't belong. He played once, under a tree where 2 of ours had fallen. We all stopped eating, let him finish, and when he did, none of us said a word, because what he carried had carried all of us for a moment. Facts no one wrote down. The softer the item, the harder the memory. A coin rubbed daily can outlast a rifle. The smell of old leather from a wallet reminds you that time didn't start with war. One pocket poem can undo a week's worth of despair. Some men carried things they never spoke of, not because they were shameful, but because they were sacred. I met a French farmer who kept a shell casing in his jacket, said it had landed in his field and didn't explode. He drilled a hole in it and strung it round his neck, called it Le Chant Silences, the quiet luck, said it reminded him that danger doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just sits at your feet and waits to be noticed. One winter night, a soldier gave me a piece of chocolate from his pocket. It was old, half melted, wrapped in a piece of wax paper with his daughter's name written on it, Emma. It read. He broke it in half. We shared it under a collapsed roof, and for those few minutes, as the chocolate stuck to our teeth, we remembered what sweetness tasted like. Afterward, he told me that's the last thing she gave me before I left. Said it was for when I needed to smile. We both smiled, but it hurt. The war taught us to hide what mattered in the smallest places, because the big places, the towns, the speeches, the borders, they were always under siege, but the small ones, the pockets, the palms, the fold of paper pressed to your chest, those could still protect something real. I found a button once, not mine, plain, brown, worn at the edges. I kept it. Still don't know why. Maybe because it had survived. Maybe because it felt like proof that something had held together while everything else fell apart. I still have it in a drawer sometimes. I press it between my fingers like it's a kind of prayer. After the war, when we changed out of our uniforms, men reached into their pockets and didn't know what to do with what they found. A small shell, a matchbook, a locket, piece soap carved into a horse, and suddenly silence felt louder than the bombs, because these were the last things they'd chosen for themselves. Everything else had been assigned, but a pocket that had been theirs. I still check my coat before hanging it each night. Instinct, muscle memory, feel for weight, shape, familiar. Its corners. We didn't sleep like civilians. We didn't undress. We didn't fold clothes. Didn't tuck ourselves in. We slept with our boots on, not out of habit, but out of necessity, because war doesn't knock. It doesn't announce itself politely. It breaks in. And the only question is how fast you can run when it does. There's something you learn when you try to rest with mud on your feet. You never fully rest. Your sleep becomes a truce, not a surrender. Your dreams become tunnels, narrow, echoing, always one step from collapse, and you learn not to close both eyes at once. It's not really. It's enough to pretend, just enough to say, I'll borrow peace for a little while. Some men tried. They'd kick off their boots, roll socks into little pillows, curl up like boys again, but they always woke slower. And in war, slow means dead. So most of us learned. Boots stayed on. Even if they were soaked, even if they stank, even if they blistered us into silence. Better a limp than a grave. I remember my first night sleeping in full gear, helmet digging into my skull, pack still strapped on. The ground was colder than it had any right to be. And every sound, every branch, every cough, every wind gust felt like a test I might fail. I don't know if I slept at all, but in the morning when the shelling came, I was ready, and that's what mattered. You start to notice things when you sleep like that, how the fabric of your uniform rubs raw in the same spot every night, how your boots creak when you shift your legs, how your body molds itself into a version of vigilance that no piece could ever unshape. We called it half sleep, but really it was a kind of death rehearsal. Practice for the stillness you hoped would never become permanent. Not because I think something's there, but because once everything that kept me human was the facts that slept with their boots on. You start to notice things when you sleep like that, how the fabric of your uniform rubs raw in the same spot every night, how your boots creak when you shift your legs, how your body molds itself into a version of vigilance that no piece could ever unshape. We called it half sleep, but really it was a kind of death rehearsal. Practice for the stillness you hoped would never become permanent. The facts written on mess tins. We didn't just eat from our mess tins. We wrote on them, scratched into them, carved little pieces of ourselves into that dull, battered aluminum because it was the only canvas no one tried to censor. Most soldiers thought of them as plates or bowls or maybe just containers of heat. But we knew better. They were diaries with lids. The Army gave us standard issue tins, same size, same color, same sharp-edged handles that burned your fingers if you weren't careful. But by the third week, none of them looked alike. Some were blackened with fire. Some were dented from drops and marches. Some were carved so deep you could run your thumb along the edge and read someone's memories without words. You just had to know how to listen. I scratched my mother's initials into the bottom of mine, not because I was sentimental, but because it reminded me who had fed me before the world went mad. Some men wrote prayers, some etched maps, some just made tally marks. Days gone, meals survived. His friends buried. One mess tin told more truth than an entire field report, because it was personal, and personal was dangerous. And dangerous meant honest. There was a man, Harris, who etched the same word into the inside lid of his tin every day. Tomorrow, over and over. Not a date, not a sentence, just the word. And one night, as we sat eating weak stew under a sky that looked like it had forgotten us, I asked him why. He said, because if I write tomorrow, I give myself permission to see it. He made it through. Not everyone did, but his mess tin was a calendar made of hope. We learned that food wasn't just nourishment, it was memory, it was rhythm. It's one thing that still resembled normal. And when you poured something hot into your mess tin for a brief moment, the metal warmed your fingers and fooled your heart into thinking you weren't in hell. Facts from the mess tin. A chipped rim teaches you how to drink sideways. Scratches become stories when no one speaks. The reflection in a tin lid shows you the war in your own eyes. You can learn a man's spirit from what he leaves in the bottom. Sound of a spoon against aluminum can feel louder than a bomb. One soldier drew a woman's silhouette on his lid. Crude lines, but careful ones, took him weeks to finish. Every night, he'd sit under the stars, scraping gently with the edge of a coin. When asked who she was, he said, "Someone I haven't met yet, but I hope she'll wait for me anyway." That tin was found years later, buried in a box of medals. No name, just her. Maybe that was the point. We cleaned them with sand, with grass, with our sleeves, but never with water. Not when water was a miracle. So every tin held residue, flavors of 100 desperate meals, from field fires, grease from hands, too tired to care. And in that residue, our lives left fingerprints. You could taste the march in your beans. You could smell the fear in your rice. You could hear the silence in your soup. There was one man, Francois, who lined his mess tin with a page from a book, replaced it every week. Didn't care what page it was, said it made the food taste like story. Once, I caught a glimpse, line from a novel I didn't recognize. Some men eat to survive, others eat to remember. He looked at me and said, "Tonight, I'm both." Then he ate with the kind of reverence usually reserved for churches. Sometimes we shared, not just food, but space, 2 spoons in one tin. 2 men kneeling in the cold, huddled over the same bitter broth. No words, just breath, steam, and the quiet acknowledgement that neither of us would make it alone. A mess tin became communion without wine, without priest, just need. In Italy, we traded mess tins for cigarettes. In Belgium, for blankets. In the East, sometimes for bread, but only when we had extras, because to give away your only tin was like handing over your heartbeat. Too risky, too final, and no soldier wanted to eat off the ground again. It's not after knowing the luxury of warm metal between cold hands. One man painted his tin red, bright, defiant. The officers were furious, but he kept it anyway. Said it made his meals feel like fire instead of surrender. That color peeled with time, but we all remembered it, because it reminded us that even in a world of uniformity, defiance could still fit in a single hand. After the war, I packed mine in a trunk. Didn't open it for years. Then one day, I made soup. Didn't know why. Just felt like I needed something familiar, and I ate it from that same battered tin, alone, in silence. And for a moment, I remembered the weight of eyes watching me, of men leaning in, of cold mornings and dirty spoons and steam rising like prayers. No one ever said aloud, and I cried, not because I was sad, but because I was full of memory, of gratitude, of ghosts. We wrote poems on them, bad ones, scratchy ones, lines that barely fit and never rhymed, but they were ours. One lyric read, "When peace returns, I'll eat slowly, I'll taste, I'll share." Another, "This tin knows more than my parents. It has seen me at my worst and still held what kept me going." No one taught us to write like that. The war did, or maybe hunger did. Hard to say. Facts you won't find in textbooks. Some men etched the names of the dead inside their lids so they wouldn't forget. Some drew maps home. Some carved jokes so they'd remember how to laugh after the last bite. Some wrote nothing, but held their tins like relics, too sacred for language. The last man I saw before the armistice was eating from his tin. Shaky hands, rice and carrots. He smiled, said, "It's warm today." It wasn't. It was freezing. But maybe warmth isn't always a temperature. Sometimes it's a memory, a choice. He offered me a bite. I declined. He said, "Take it anyway." You never know which spoonful is the one that lets you remember. I did, and I still remember, after everything, the battles, the bruises, the long roads, and longer silences. It was that tin that lasted. Not the weapons, not the flags, it's not the speeches, just a little metal container with burn marks and initials, and 1,000 invisible stories pressed into its skin. I keep it on a shelf now, next to nothing else, because it needs no companion. It is the companion to the part of me that still kneels in dirt, hands trembling, hoping the stew stays warm long enough to pretend the world is kind. The facts folded in letters, never sent. They told us to write often, said it was good for morale, felt at his home, kept the war human. That ink was the only thread tying us back to the world we left behind. But no one said what to do with the letters you couldn't send. The ones too raw, too angry, too honest. The ones that would only worry the people you loved, or disappoint them, or break them in ways the war hadn't touched yet. So we folded them quietly, slipped them into our packs, between pages of notebooks, inside socks, in the lining of jackets, behind photographs, and we carried them like secrets with no safe address. I remember the first letter I wrote that I never intended to mail. It was to my father, the man who told me to serve with pride, who kissed my shoulder and said, "You'll come back stronger." But that night, after watching a boy bleed out while calling for a mother I couldn't reach, I wrote, "You never told me that pride stinks of blood, that bravery leaves stains, that coming back stronger means carrying the silence of everyone who didn't." I never signed it, folded it into fourths, and kept it under my shirt for weeks. It soaked up sweat, fear, and the smell of smoke. It never left my chest. We all had them. John kept his in his boot, said he liked the crinkle when he walked, minded him that even lies need witnesses. Louis taped his to the bottom of his mess tin, so it would rattle slightly every time he ate, his lullaby of words unsaid. Miguel wrote his on the back of a photograph, his handwriting so small it looked like lace dot. He called it his if letter. If he lived, if he made it back, if she still waited. Sometimes we read them aloud to each other at night when sleep didn't come, but truth did. We'd pretend we were talking to the wind, or to ghosts, or to the versions of ourselves that never left home, and no one judged, because every soldier knows there's a kind of healing that only comes from writing the things you don't want anyone to read. One man wrote letters to his brother, every week. The brother had died in the last war, but still he wrote updates, thoughts, confessions. One night he read one aloud. You'd laugh at how scared I get, how soft the inside of a helmet feels when you press it to your chest and beg the sky to be empty for just one more night. I wish you were here, but only in the way that would keep you safe. After that, we started writing to the dead too, because sometimes we were the only ones who truly understood. The truth is, some letters weren't written for people. They were written for moments, for the version of you that still believed in mornings, in music, in laughter without guilt. You wrote to preserve him, even if he was already gone. And when you read those letters later, you could almost hear his voice again. Almost. Facts about letters never sent. They rarely have dates. They smell like gunpowder and sweat. They carry the weight of things you didn't say out loud for fear of what they'd change. They never end with love. But sometimes they end with forgiveness. I remember Max, the quiet one, the one with the stutter. He wrote letters every day, pages and pages, but never sealed them. Said envelopes made them too real, too dangerous. After he died, we found a tin box in his pack with over 60 folded notes, all addressed to the sky. Most of them were apologies for being afraid, for killing, for surviving when others didn't, for not crying. I read one, just one. It said, "Dear Sky, if you're watching, please forget the things my hands have done. I don't want to carry them into dreams." I didn't read the others. Some words deserve to stay folded. We had a ritual. The night before a big push, we'd each take a moment with our unsent letters, touch them, whisper to them, fold them tighter, then tuck them somewhere only we knew, because if the worst happened, they'd be the last part of us someone might find. And even if no one ever read them, they'd carry our breath, our fingerprint, our attempt at being human in a place designed to forget what that meant. Sometimes I wonder where those letters are now. Some were buried, some burned, some left behind in jackets no one claimed. Maybe a few were found, read by strangers who understood, just enough to know they weren't supposed to understand fully. And maybe that's enough. Maybe they didn't need to be answered. just witnessed. I still have mine. Not all of them, but a few. Yellowed, frayed, barely legible. And when the nights get too long, I unfold one, read it aloud, let it echo through the quiet room, and I remember that once I was someone worth writing to, even if it was just myself. There's a letter I never wrote, but I think about it often. It would have started, to the man I became. I'm sorry. You deserved a better beginning, but you survived. And that matters. Maybe I'll write it someday. Maybe I already have. Here, now, to you. Because maybe that's the real reason we wrote. Not to explain the war, not to justify it, not to document it, but to leave behind proof that we felt something, feared something, loved something enough to put it on paper, even if no one ever saw it. Facts you won't find in museums. Ink runs when it meets tears, even dried ones. Graphite holds onto pain better than bullets. Folded paper survives longer than memories. Letters never sent are often the only ones that tell the truth. If you ever come across one, a letter with no stamp, no name, no address, don't throw it away. Read it, or don't, but hold it. Let it remind you that someone, once, in the middle of something too big to name, tried to speak to someone who couldn't hear them, and that effort alone was a kind of hope. The facts that slept inside helmets. They gave us helmets to protect our heads, but no one told us they'd also have to protect our thoughts. You learn quickly, in war, that your mind is just as breakable as your body. That sometimes what you see can't be unseen, and what you carry behind your eyes is heavier than anything strapped to your back. So the helmet became more than armor. It became shelter, a private room you could wear, a boundary between the outside noise and the quiet that still dared to exist inside. We wore them even when we didn't have to. Not because we feared bullets, but because they helped us hold things in tears, memories, names, dreams. It was easier to keep them tucked beneath the rim of steel than to let them spill into the open air, where someone might try to fix you, or worse, pity you. And no soldier wants pity. At night, we'd take them off and use them as pillows, turned upside down, lined with a rag, nestled into the dirt like a cradle for the thoughts we weren't ready to speak. I remember resting my head and hearing the soft echo of my own breathing. It was like sleeping inside a shell, the world muffled, time slowed, memories distant. There were nights when it felt safer inside that hollow steel than inside my own chest. There was a boy named Keats. He was younger than the rest, still had freckles, still spoke of his mother in the present tense. He used to keep a folded photo in his helmet. A girl holding a balloon. Sister, he said. Every night before sleep, he'd whisper to the photo like it could hear him through the steel. Then, one day, during shelling, his helmet rolled off and split open on a rock. Photo gone. Keats changed after that, spoke less, ate slower, stopped sleeping with the helmet under his head. When I asked why, he said, "It's not home anymore." Helmets carried more than protection. They carried dirt from 5 different countries, bits of ash, rainwater, notes folded into sweatbands, coins someone gave you before you left, a stone from a place you hoped to return to. They weren't just gear. They were suitcases for the soul. And when someone died, we didn't always have time to bury them properly. But if we could, we'd place their helmet over their chest, not out of protocol, but out of recognition. This held you, we were saying, and now it will keep part of you safe. Facts about helmets. The inside smells like your fear. The outside holds the weather you wish would end. You can tell how long someone's been at the front by the rust on their rim. Helmets amplify silence more than they muffle noise. They make terrible pillows, but somehow you sleep anyway. One man, Tompkins, painted the inside of his helmet blue. Just a patch. Said it reminded him of the sky back home. said it helped him breathe when the trench walls felt too tight. Another soldier wrote a prayer along the edge, in pencil, had to rewrite it every week. Let the metal break before the mind. That was the line he always started with. There was something holy about it, not in the religious sense, but in the desperate, human one. We learned to listen for helmet sounds, the clink when you dropped it near your feet, the scrape of metal on stone, the drumbeat of rain tapping its surface while you waited in silence, the hollow thud it made when someone fell and didn't rise. Each sound had a meaning. Each sound reminded us, you were not invincible, not even close. Once, we lost a man Wells. Took hours to find him. Eventually, we did. Buried halfway in mud, alive, barely. But what led us there wasn't his voice. It was the glint of his helmet, half buried, but catching the dying light like a flare. His first words were, "Didn't think I'd need the thing to scream for me." We laughed. Plus, that's what you do when something sacred saves you. Scratched my name into the underside of mine. Not because I thought someone would need to identify me, but because I needed to remember it myself. Some days, that name felt foreign, like it belonged to a man I'd left behind on a different shore, in a different uniform with a different heart. But the helmet reminded me, "You're still here," it said, "for now." There was an old superstition. Never wear a dead man's helmet. Bad luck, bad spirits, bad endings. But war doesn't care for superstition. Sometimes all we had were the things left behind, and sometimes putting on a fallen soldier's helmet was the only way to keep moving. You wore it and silently said, "I'll carry the rest of you too, if I must." Facts never printed. Some helmets carried chalk drawings, smudged hearts, stick figures, tiny messages no one else could decode. Some were lined with cloth from home, torn sleeves, handkerchiefs, a piece of a wedding dress. One man carried a letter folded so tightly it curved with the steel, not because he was afraid, but because he wasn't ready to forget at night. I'd sometimes remove mine and place it beside me, facing up like an empty bowl, like an invitation. If sleep came, I imagined my nightmares would fall into it instead of into me. Some nights it worked. Some nights I'd wake up gasping, fingers clutching the rim like a drowning man grabs driftwood. But it helped, because even nightmares need a place to land, and a helmet hollow, waiting, offered just enough space. There was a day snow falling. Softly, you could forget what season it was. We were tired, hungry, still moving. A man fell behind, dropped to his knees, said nothing. We gathered around him. No one spoke. He reached into his helmet and pulled out a small, crumpled note, read it to himself, then stood back up. Helmet on. March resumed. I never asked what it said, but I wrote my own that night and tucked it under the liner. Still have it, still unread. When the war ended, many left their helmets behind, on roadsides, in bunkers, on graves. I see OULDN, single quotes. Mine came home with me, sat on a shelf, then in a drawer, then in a box. Years later, I opened it, expected rust, dust, but instead, I found a small pressed flower taped inside the crown. Hadn't remembered doing it. Still don't, but it was there and somehow made sense. Sometimes, I think the helmet held me together more than it protected me. It gave shape to the chaos, gave silence somewhere to echo. It became a room I could carry, a shield that didn't just block bullets, but feelings too. And when I sleep now, it sits on my nightstand. Not as a relic, but as a reminder that even steel can cradle something fragile. Even war leaves behind the tools for peace if you know how to hold them differently. The facts left on the roadside. We left more than footprints behind us, more than tracks in the mud or broken branches or empty shell casings. We left pieces of gear, of memory, of ourselves. The road never asked for them, but it kept them anyway, like a silent archive of things we were too tired to carry. And years later, if you walked those same roads, you could find them still, hidden beneath moss, curled into the roots of trees, whispering beneath the wind. I remember my first roadside goodbye. It was a boot, torn, soaked through, its sole flapping like the mouth of something too exhausted to speak. The man who left it TBS did so without a word, stepped out of it mid-march, left it sitting on a rock, and walked on in one sock. When I asked, he said it was heavier than it looked. That's all, but we all knew it wasn't about the boot. It was about what it had walked through and what he refused to keep walking with. The roadside became confession, a place where things fell or were left or simply disappeared. Cigarette tins, tog tags with no chain, a cracked lens from a pair of glasses, pages from journals torn and dropped like breadcrumbs that never led home. Some were accidents, but most were deliberate, a letting go, a quiet surrender, a whispered, enough. Facts about the roadside. It remembers better than we do. It holds stories no historian can retell. The dirt knows the weight of things abandoned in silence. It grows over grief, but never fully swallows it. One afternoon, we passed a stretch of road where photographs littered the ditch, dozens, all face down, slick from rain, edges curling, ghosts bleeding into the paper. We didn't stop to pick them up. No one said why, but I think we knew they weren't for us. Someone had dropped them like tears they'd finally allowed to fall. And some things, grief is sacred, even when it lies face down in the mud. I left something once, a letter I wrote to my brother. Long, angry, honest, too heavy to send, too sharp to keep. So one day, when we stopped to rest, I reached into my coat, unfolded the page, and laid it gently in. The fork of a tree. No rock, no weight. Let the wind take it if it wanted. But it did, it stayed. And I walked away feeling 5 ounces lighter, maybe more. Sometimes we found things, a single glove, a broken compass, a ribbon tied around a nail, an open locket with a woman's face inside. No name, no note, no clue. We never asked who they belonged to. We just carried them for a while, pocketed them, tied them to our packs. Little borrowed memories, little burdens we volunteered for because it felt wrong to leave them. Fully alone, even lost things deserve a bit of company. There was a soldier Andre, French, quiet. He had a small, blue marble he'd found in a ditch outside Cannes. Said it reminded him of his childhood, of games in alleyways, of laughter that wasn't cut short by sirens. He carried that marble in his shirt pocket for months. Then, one day, through a long march through soaked terrain, he knelt beside a stone and placed the marble underneath it. Said nothing, just walked on. When I asked, he said, "It belonged to the boy I used to be. And he's not marching anymore." Facts no one teaches. Letting go is a skill soldiers learn faster than marching. Not everything lost was forgotten. Some of the most sacred goodbyes don't involve words. This road keeps secrets better than any grave. One time, we found a harmonica on the roadside, dented, rust along the mouthpiece, but still Playbable. None of us knew who left it, but that night, under a broken sky, someone played a song we didn't recognize. It wasn't beautiful, but it was enough to remind us that even in the land of screams and silence, there could still be melody. Just one song, one breath, one echo of something human. Then the harmonica was left behind again, placed carefully on a stump, like an offering, or maybe a thank you. People think the war is only carried forward in memories, in trauma, in scars, but they forget what we left behind. The jacket draped over a tree, the unfinished sketch carved into a stone, the handkerchief knotted around a branch, fluttering like a flag. No one saluted. Each one a sentence we never finished. Each one a footnote to a story. No one asked us to write, but we lived anyway. I still remember a trail of footprints that ended at the edge of a frozen river. No body, no blood, just the prints and a belt neatly coiled, resting on a rock like a question mark. We didn't search, not because we didn't care, but because we knew the answer. Some questions in war are asked by absence, and the roadside always listens. I kept a rock from Normandy, flat, smooth, gray as ash, carried it in my coat for months. Then one day I dropped it into a stream and didn't watch it sink. I just needed to know that something I held close could go back to the earth without ceremony, without consequence. It helped more than I expected. There was a woman, Elsa, a medic, sharp-eyed, quieter than most. She carried a red ribbon tied in a knot, said it was from a child. Didn't say more. Then, one morning, she tied it around the branch of a half-dead tree and walked away. She never looked back, but every man in our unit did, because that ribbon said more than orders or flags or medals ever could. It said, I remember, but I'm not carrying it any further. Facts you'll never read in books. A soldier can leave behind 10 pounds of gear and still feel heavier afterward. The ground remembers what you don't. Not every goodbye is spoken. Some things are dropped, not because they're broken, but because we are. Years after the war, I walked one of the roads again, older, tired, softer. I didn't expect to find anything, but I did. A spoon, bent, blackened, still shaped like a hand had once held it with intention. I picked it up, held it, closed my eyes, and for a moment, the voices came back. The fires, the feet, the singing, the silence. Then I placed it back down, exactly where I found it, because some things are meant to be returned to the story they came from. Think of the roadside often, not the roads, the sides, the forgotten places, the margins, the quiet corners where the war whispered instead of screamed, because that's where truth lived. That's where the soldier stopped being just a shape in a uniform and became a person again, a child again, a soul again, just for a moment, long enough to let go, long enough to be seen by no one. The facts pressed between photographs. They told us to pack light. They meant extra socks, cigarettes, rations, but none of us listened exactly, because some of us packed eyes, laughter, scents we didn't know how to describe. Most of all, dash faces, photographs, mostly folded, faded, stiff with the oil from our fingers. You could almost guess who someone loved by how often they reached into their coat. Some checked their photos every night, some only on birthdays. Some never looked at them again, afraid the face would be different than how memory had framed it. But we all carried one, not because we missed home, but because it reminded us that we still had one. I kept mine inside my boot, right against the ankle. It was of my father, standing next to a tree he planted when I was born. He was smiling, but the kind of smile that didn't show teeth, like he wanted to cry but needed to hold the line. I remember looking at that photo after our first bombardment. Everything smelled like copper and wet stone. And for a moment, I forgot what his voice sounded like. The picture helped just a little, not because it gave me strength, but because it reminded me who I'd have to tell the story to if I survived. And that was enough facts about photographs. They never age, but you do. You can fold them to fit any pocket, but the feelings stay full size. The creases become part of the memory. Even blurred faces can make you cry if the hands holding them once held you. There was a man porter, always calm, never raised his voice. He had a photo of a little boy and a note on the back. You're my reason. He read it every morning, out loud, like a ritual. Said it kept the war from creeping into his head before the day began. Then, One day, he tore it in half and placed it inside his helmet, one half on the left side, one on the right. He never said why, but I think I understood. Not all photos were of people. Some were of dogs, bicycles, houses, clouds. One man had a picture of an old fishing boat he and his brother used to steal during summers. Said he never fished again after the war, but he kept the photo because it reminded him of the kind of rules worth breaking and the kind of silence that came only with drifting, not marching. We learned not to ask if someone was staring at a photo. It gave them space, even in a foxhole, even under fire. That small square of paper was sometimes the last barrier between a man and collapse. It wasn't just nostalgia, it was identity, a passport back to the self they left behind. There were moments when men gave their photos away to strangers, to civilians, to children on the roadside, like currency, like prayers. One soldier, Henry, gave his to a nurse. Didn't speak the language, but just pressed the photo into her palm before boarding a truck he never returned from. On the back, he'd written, "If I forget who I am, show them this." No one ever did, but the photo still existed, somewhere, still holding the shape of his hope. Facts hidden in corners. Some soldiers carried photos of people who didn't love them back. Some carried ones they'd torn, then taped again. Some had no one, so they carried photos they found. One man had a blank square of paper, said it was for the face he hadn't met yet. Rain ruined many of them, but not all. Some were waxed, some laminated with tape, some wrapped in cloth, sealed with string, and kissed like relics before battle. You could tell how much someone wanted to live by how carefully they protected a piece of paper. More than maps, more than orders, more than medals. Photographs held the quiet parts of us that war hadn't devoured yet. One night, in a trench lit only by moonlight, a man started drawing, not writing, drawing with charcoal. On the inside flap of his jacket, he was sketching a face, not from a photo, but from memory. Each line tentative, deliberate. When I asked who it was, he said, "My mother. I lost a real photo 3 months ago." He didn't cry, just kept drawing, and when he finished, he folded the jacket shut, caught like closing a book, and smiled for the first time in days. Photos didn't always bring comfort. Sometimes they brought ache. Like seeing a child you knew had aged since the image was taken, or a lover you suspected had stopped waiting, or a version of yourself you couldn't recognize anymore. Some soldiers burned their photos, not out of anger, but out of mercy, because memory can be heavier than a weapon, and some hearts deserve release. Even if it comes in ash. Facts that lived in ink. Most soldiers had only one photo. Some carried 3, but showed none. Others traced the outlines at night, as if the paper were skin. Some never looked at them again after the first loss. Some held them even in death. I once saw a man shot clean through, still clutching a photo in a hand that refused to relax. We didn't pry it away, just folded his fingers tighter, and buried him with it, because even strangers deserve to be remembered by the face they loved most. I came across a ruined village once. Windows shattered, doors gone, only stone and silence left. Inside what used to be a home, on the floor, was a photo. A family, mother, father, 2 children, dust covered, footprints smudged, but intact. I picked it up, wiped it clean, tucked it into my coat. I didn't know them, but I needed to carry something real after walking through so much ghost. That photo stayed with me until the end of the war, and when I finally reached home, I placed it on my nightstand next to my own family's portrait, because remembrance, I think, isn't always about names. Sometimes it's just about not letting the image disappear today. I keep them in a box, the ones that survived. They're cracked, faded, framed in the scent of time. But they're still here. Each one a fact the history books forgot. Each one a testament that even in the worst of war, some part of us still knew how to carry love on something as fragile as paper, and to protect it with everything we had left. The facts waited in silence. They never talk about the waiting, not in the books, not in the documentaries, not in the parades, but waiting was the war, not the bangs, not the shouts, not the trumpet blare of history, just time, heavy, slow, silent, and the strange truth that most of war isn't what happens, but what doesn't. I remember sitting in a trench for 14 hours without moving. No orders, no sound. It's just mud and breath and thoughts that wouldn't quiet down. The enemy wasn't across the field. The enemy was the ticking in my chest, and every second I waited was a second. I wasn't the same man anymore. Facts about silence. It isn't empty. It's full. It has shape and weight and teeth. It teaches you who you are when no one is looking. It's where fear grows its roots. Some men feared bullets. Others feared the silence between them, because that's where the mind went wandering. Two things it shouldn't. Two people we might never see again. Two letters not yet written. Two voices we missed and memories we tried to bury under orders. The stillness was the battlefield, and we lost parts of ourselves on it quietly. There was a night so still the air wouldn't breathe. Even the wind stood still. We were told to hold the line. No movement, no light, no talking, just hold. So we did. For 12 hours, each of us became a statue of breath. Okay. And in that time, I counted the number of buttons on my coat 20 times, just to remember I was still here, that I still had a body, still had a name, still had fingers that could count, even when the soul didn't want to. You learned to listen differently, the way boots whispered on wood, the tone of a cough 3 foxholes down, the crack of frozen mud beneath pressure. Each sound meant something. Each silence meant more. We became interpreters of nothingness, specialists in stillness, experts in the sound of waiting. There was a man Marek, tall, always chewing the inside of his cheek when things got quiet. He told me once, the silence has a voice. You just have to stop talking long enough to hear it. I didn't understand until much later, when the noise finally stopped for good, and I was left alone in a train car, traveling back home, with nothing but the creak of metal and the sound of my own breathing. And I heard it, the silence, speaking everything I hadn't wanted to hear. Facts, the silence told me. You're not the same man who left. The war inside doesn't end with the one outside. What you didn't say weighs more than what you did. Some ghosts knock, others whisper. We used to play games to fight the waiting, count the crows, guess the cloud shapes, invent the names of stars we couldn't see. Some men told the same story over and over again just to fill the time. One man recited his piece, another sang lullabies under his breath. One whistled the same tune so often we began to hum it even in our sleep, not because we liked it, but because it was company. Even a bad melody is better than silence that stares. There were silences of hunger, of fear, of exhaustion, of guilt, but the worst silence was hope, the kind that lingered before the letter came, or the mission started, or the retreat was called. That aching stretch of maybe, where you couldn't grieve yet, but you also couldn't rejoice. The waiting room of the soul, where everything was possible and nothing was happening. One morning, we waited for a supply drop that never came. Watched the sky for 4 hours, empty, no planes, no birds, no reason, just blue and blue and blue dot. And in that silence, one man broke, screamed at the sky, threw his helmet, wept into the dirt, and we let him, Because sometimes the only sound left is the one silence rings from you. Facts no one writes down. Silence is not absence. It's pressure. Waiting is a kind of warfare. The longest battle is the one that never starts. You can lose yourself without ever being fired upon. I kept a journal, not of events, but of ours. I marked time like a prisoner, tally after tally after tally, noting the quiet moments, the ones without glory, without wounds, without purpose, and yet those were the moments that changed me the most, because they asked the question, who are you when nothing is required of you? And some days I had no answer, just silence. There was a chapel in one village, no roof, no walls, just a foundation and a bell, still rang somehow. And one night I sat there alone and listened to the wind, to the rats, to the soft hiss of snow landing on stone. And I realized the war might never end. Not in me, not in the world, not really. But in that moment, there was nothing but stillness. And it didn't ask for anything, didn't require fear, or sorrow, or memory, just breath. And I gave it, for the first time in months. I breathed without armor. There's a kind of silence after loss that hums, not with sound, but with weight. It lives in letters never opened, in beds left made, in drawers of old clothes. I carried that silence back home, wrapped in my coat, pressed between the pages of my journal, stitched into the seams of my uniform. And some nights, when everything is still, I take it out, not to mourn, but to remember that even in war, there were hours untouched by violence, moments filled with nothing but being alive. The world doesn't make space for silence anymore. Too loud, too fast, too filled. But in the war, we learned to sit with it, to drink from it, to sleep in it, to cry into it without needing a reply. Because silence wasn't emptiness. It was presence, unspoken, unshaken, unavoidable. And for those of us who made it back, it became the place we still visit when the noise of memory gets too loud. The facts that slept in ash. Some places weren't destroyed by fire. They were replaced by it. Whole towns turned to ash. Not rubble, not ruin. It's just fine, gray memory blowing sideways in the wind. That's where we learned. Some facts don't get written down. Rise and smoke and settle into the folds of your coat when you walk through what used to be a doorway. We passed through cities with no names left. Street signs melted. House numbers blackened. Church bells turned into puddles of silence. One morning, I stood in the center of a bakery, or what had once been one. There were still loaves burnt into stone shapes, trapped mid-rise inside a collapsed oven, and on the counter, a ceramic teacup that had cracked but didn't fall. Somehow, it held ash like water, perfectly balanced. A bowl of dust, like someone had served it on purpose. I stared at it for too long, not because it meant something, but because it didn't. And that was the part that stayed. Facts that live in ash. Paper becomes languageless. Photographs blur into silhouettes. Toys stop being toys. Names are the first thing the fire takes. There was a coat in the ruins of a school, hung neatly on a peg, half burnt, still upright. Beneath it, a pair of shoes too small for any soldier. I didn't touch them. None of us did. Not out of fear, but out of reverence. We'd seen enough by then to understand that even absence deserves space. Even ash has ghosts. One, Soldier Allen carried a small pouch filled with pieces of things he found in ruins. A marble, half a spoon, a corner of a book page that only said ... And then he smiled. He called it his evidence, said he needed to remind himself that lives had existed, that somewhere before the blast, someone had breakfast, or laughed, or told a child they'd be home by noon. We never asked what he did with the pouch after the war, but I like to think he buried it somewhere quiet, somewhere no fire could reach again. There were ashes that didn't belong to buildings. Some of them used to be uniforms, others letters, Jews. We knew what had happened, even when no one said it, because silence has a scent, and ash has a history, even if no one's alive to recite it. We passed through a forest once that had been bombed so many times the trees had no bark left. Naked pillars, cockle sculptures, and among them what remained of a piano, just a frame, and a single key, middle C dot. Someone pressed it. It didn't sound, but the motion felt sacred, as if touching that one silent note was a way of telling the past. I heard you, even now. I hear you. Facts hidden in soot. Some books survive only as shadows on walls. Children's names can still be found, etched into brick. Porcelain sometimes endures what flesh cannot. Even fire has favorites. There was a village with no roof left in sight, yet one window stood untouched. A lace curtain fluttered, still clean, still white. We thought it was a mistake, but then an old woman stepped out of the shadows, bent, barefoot, holding a broom made of tied branches. She nodded once, then swept the doorstep that no longer existed, not because it mattered, but because it used to, and that was enough. After the war, we heard that many survivors rebuilt on ashes. They didn't clear the ruins, just built atop them, layer upon layer, homes over pain, roofs over silence, new laughter over old echoes. I think there's something brave in that, something deeply human, the choice to live, not after the ashes, but with them. Sometimes, when I close my eyes now, I see the shapes we used to ignore, charred staircases, burnt dolls, fire-singed wedding rings that no one could claim. And I wonder, were those facts too, as facts that didn't make it into the archives, a set that never got medals or mentions or names, just soot and silence. There's a church in Berlin still standing, with half its roof gone. They never fixed it, not fully, left the hole open so that rain could fall through and birds could nest inside. Called it a memorial, but I think it's something else. I think it's a wound that chose not to close on purpose, because not everything that heals disappears, and not everything that remains is broken. Facts that linger in smoke. Pain doesn't vanish, it settles. Fire rewrites without permission. Survivors carry timelines in their bones. Some silence is inherited. One man I knew carried a jar of ash, sealed, wrapped in cloth, never opened it, never explained it, just held it in his lap when the world felt too loud. He called it his anchor. I never asked what it meant, but I think I understand now. Today, when I light a candle at night, I sometimes let it burn too long, let it drip, let it darken the plate beneath it, and as I clean the wax and ash, I pause, because even that tiny black smudge reminds me fire once stood here and didn't win. It tried, but I'm still here. We are still here, writing facts it couldn't erase. Ash is not the end, it's a page turned too fast. A whisper where a name once rang, a lullaby cut short, but the song still exists, somewhere and in sleep. If you're quiet enough, you can still hear it, drifting, warm, carried in the dust of those who loved even after everything burned. The facts learned to bloom again. Not everything grew back. Some fields never returned to green. Some walls never found bricks again. Some names were never rewritten on any mailbox, but somehow life still remembered how to reach. Even from places the war forgot to bury. It started small, a sprout between two cracks in a bombed road, a child's laugh echoing in a train station once filled with departure, a mother planting herbs in an old helmet because it was the only thing that held soil. These weren't declarations of victory. They were quiet rebellions against grief, against erasure, against forgetting how to begin again. Facts about blooming. Flowers don't ask permission. Some seeds sleep for years before daring to rise. The soil remembers. Its roots can grow in places where blood once pooled. I returned to a town once swallowed by smoke, where the rooftops had been teeth and every window screamed. But now, a bakery stood there, real, warm, and a child with flour on her cheek ran past me, laughing. The wind didn't carry ash anymore, just cinnamon, and I stood there, not crying, but not breathing either, because that scent was more defiant than any anthem. There were scars on the buildings, clacked in stone, cracked mosaics, bent railings, but no one hid them. They left the marks, like stories, unedited, unashamed, and I began to see that survival wasn't about what was rebuilt. It was about how the cafe had placed its tables right beneath a ceiling that once collapsed, how the museum displayed a broken violin beside a new one, how lovers kissed in the square where boots used to march. I met a man in Warsaw who grew roses in bomb casings, said the metal retains warmth better than pots. He painted each one with names: Alina, Maka, Marek, Silence. He called them his garden of echoes. And when I asked why he didn't plant in real soil, he smiled and said, because this is where they died. So this is where I choose for something to live. Facts beneath the petals. Blooming is a kind of resistance. Its color returns slower than sound. Grief waters roots more than rain. Hope doesn't knock, it grows. I walked past a school one spring, fresh paint, laughter leaking through windows. Children reciting names of people long gone. They weren't learning war. They were learning peace in fragments, in questions, in songs made of pieces their grandparents once sang in hiding. And I realized this is the legacy that matters, not medals, not strategies, but the ability to speak softly without fear. After the war, I couldn't hold a spoon right for months. Too used to gripping a rifle. I planted carrots, badly, but the earth accepted them. Anyway, each sprout felt like an apology to the things my hands had held. And when I finally pulled one free, small and crooked, I laughed for the first time without guilt behind my teeth, because it meant I could still feed something, still coax life. From soil instead of silence, from command. There's a tree in France with initials carved all over its bark, some from soldiers, some from lovers, some from children who didn't know either. It grew anyway, didn't shed the marks, just expanded around them, held them like veins, and every year its flowers still bloom on branches shaped by scars. Facts found in spring, the first green. After winter is always the softest. Children play louder where silence used to live. Birds return without maps. Some wounds only close when someone laughs nearby in a rebuilt church. I watched a bride walk down an aisle once soaked in ash. The floor had been replaced, but the chandelier above her still bore smoke stains. She didn't look up, didn't need to. She wasn't erasing the past. She was layering love over it, like laying a quilt over an old bruise. Not to hide it, just to warm it. I kept my journal, a one from the trenches. I filled the empty pages with names of flowers. I learned to grow. Crocus, lily, snapdragon, forget, dash me, dash not. Each name felt like a prayer I could plant, a truth without pain, a fact that needed no footnote. And when I ran out of pages, I buried the journal in the garden. Let the worms eat the war, word by word. There was a boy I met, maybe 10 years old. He found a dented helmet in a field. Most children would have worn it like a crown. Pretended to be generals, but he turned it upside down and filled it with wildflowers. And when I asked what he was doing, he said, making a nest, not a fortress, not a tomb, a nest, somewhere for birds to return to. Facts folded into endings. War ends in silence, but healing begins in sound. Rebirth isn't loud, it's persistent. Dean, the smallest acts carried the most defiance. Some stories don't need to be told, just lived. I remember the last time I visited the field, the one where nothing used to grow, where boots had sunk so deep even ghosts got stuck. There was grass now, soft, unapologetic, and in the middle, a single tree, young, thin, but holding itself up. Someone had hung a ribbon on it, blue. I don't know what it meant. Maybe a promise, maybe a goodbye, maybe just the wind's way of saying thank you. I sat beneath that tree for an hour. No thoughts, no prayers, it's breath. Because sometimes peace doesn't arrive with music. It arrives with stillness that no longer hurts. When I returned home, truly home, I planted a seed. Didn't expect it to grow, but it did. And every year since, it blooms, quiet, steady, never needing an audience, just light, just time, just the courage to bloom where the facts once burned.